Hey Susie, thanks for meeting with me.
Of course, Dana. So excited to talk about hashtag resist.
Amen.
Mm.
So, you are working on reproductive justice.
Hmm.
My topic has been principles and beliefs.
Yep,
And hashtag resist for me seems to encapsulate the whole of Unitarian Universalists. Listen,
exactly. Especially in this time period, especially in this decade.
definitely. So, what has come up for you? What have
Yeah,
you found super interesting?
absolutely. So I think starting off, it was really interesting to me that, well, one, there was a lot less sort of information and content about reproductive justice. I feel like in past decades, it's been almost every year there was a resolution passed about abortion access and or population control. Those are really big focuses in like the late 80s and 90s. And this time there were, I think, only five resolutions that touched on women's rights and reproductive justice, and only like two that explicitly spoke to abortion.
Which is
So
really interesting because I'd say in the past decade, we've had the most movement,
mhm.
especially with attacks and repeals on legislation in the wider country.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot going on politically. And I wonder if part of this is because the UUA was so aligned at this point on their stance on abortion, on women's reproductive justice, that, maybe they didn't feel the need to state it as explicitly. But in 2015, they actually did put out what they call a statement of conscience about embracing the reproductive justice framework. And I think that's really important because, they've been talking about reproductive rights for a really long time, but reproductive justice is a term that came about in the 90s and was inclusive of women of color, particularly Black women, and the intersections that touch on reproductive justice. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm, hmm.
And so this statement of conscience lays out a lot of information about reproductive justice, the intersectionalities of reproductive justice, including things like living wages, supporting housing, equality in like medical care, all of these things that maybe they've touched on here and there in the past, but were really encapsulated in, gosh, this is like 5 pages about reproductive justice. And so I was really impressed how sort of explicit and comprehensive this was in
Hmm.
2015.
Yeah, especially with its multi-year focus.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, asking not just, and so yeah, it does have a multi-year focus, kind of, all these activities that go on. But additionally, what this does is it lays out really explicit pathways to work for reproductive justice. And so this statement of conscience has what individuals can do, what we can do within relationships and congregations, and then what the association can do itself. And so I thought this was really awesome too, in the sense of providing, in the past, they've provided a lot of like theological grounding and information
Mhm.
about why you should support women's rights and reproductive rights. But this gives explicit pathways to praxis. And I think that's something I'm seeing more and more in the past few decades is the UUA stepping up to say, we're not just talking about this, we're actually living into these principles.
Most definitely. And I'd say that we've seen that kind of call to action in the eighth principle, which was introduced but not adopted by the UUA. More than 200 congregations across the United States have adopted the eighth principle. But as a whole, we haven't done that. And then we had this shift from principles to values, which I think, again, call us to give perspective and action, right? A praxis to these six, really seven values if we consider love, which is at the center.
Mhm.
But it is not just a statement that we believe in justice or equity or generosity, but it is a call to actually practice it, to see it within the fabric of our denomination and faith
Mhm.
as a way that we live out our faith.
Yeah. And can you remind me when that came out again, when we sort of shifted into those values?
So those values were adopted at the 2024 General Assembly, but were introduced in, I believe it was 2022. So there were 3 years of review. There was the introduction, there was the development of the language, there was a review and vote. And I can tell you at the 2023 General Assembly, I was able to attend in person. I took UU Polity at that time with Dr. Meg. Um, and it was my first in-person business meeting. It was really interesting hearing the moderator ask for everyone to give focus to the greater good and the whole rather than the individual connection and or feelings to the principles. And people were invited up to the mic to speak pro or con. And I was really surprised at the number of people that came up to the con mic, spoke very personally. The principles are so important to me when I first came, these things. And the other shocking piece about that was the number of representatives from congregations that were not familiar with the material of Article 2 in the bylaws.
Oh.
They were told in their communities, this is no good, vote against it. They
Mm.
came to General Assembly, listened, learned, spoke with other people, and came up to the mic really mournful in their understanding that if my congregation knew what
Mm.
this was actually about, they would not have asked me to vote against it.
Interesting.
It was really interesting, and worth the trip to go
Yeah.
out and see, do, be a part of. But ultimately, that passed. Here we are with these values, and I think where reproductive justice falls in there is under justice.
Hmm.
Definitely, it's
Absolutely.
under equity because we no longer use the terminology women's health and reproductive
Right.
justice. So that really represents that span of equality and removing this idea of gender,
Mhm.
which is really important. And I think we can speak transformation there too. That is,
Absolutely.
it's the hope and ultimate goal that we see these systems transform. But I also think ultimately that we want to see a transformation in the way that people have access to care, education, and how they are treated within in these systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought up the gender identity piece because that's a shift I've really seen in this decade and the past decade is in, from the 50s all the way through the 90s, it was really focused on women's access to healthcare, mothers, really laying out a gender binary there. And what we're seeing now is language that we support every person's right to have children, every person's right to parent, to access medical care. And I think to your point about equity and justice, that's acknowledging as well the shifts in being more accepting and uplifting of trans identities, of non-binary identities. I was really interested, it's not related specifically to reproductive justice, but to see discussion of intersex identities and rights for people with those identities. And so I really love this sort of expansiveness. And yeah, I think also what we're seeing is a shift in the focus of reproductive justice. So in the past, it was really focused on family planning and abortion access.
Mhm.
And with the intersectionalities of reproductive justice, there's this really expanded focus on things like healthcare, healthcare to ensure that women are healthy through pregnancies or reproductive decisions,
Mhm.
economic justice, because we know that being a parent or having a child is really expensive. And so making sure that people have the resources, education for those children that are brought into the world. And so I think it's really interesting too that they're beginning to touch on and bring in all these related pieces. And going back to the beliefs and principles, I'm curious if you see an expansion in those as it relates to intersectionality when we go through this period.
Definitely. Actually, at the 2026 General Assembly, there is a resolution to stop the hate, protect and support our transgender and gender nonconforming families. I think this really represents, again, those values and the non binary focus. Where they're calling out that transgender people have human rights, fundamental human rights, treatment by law enforcement, isolation that can impact health and well-being. Um, it goes on to talk about the risk of violence, suicide, as well as this need. And again, the call, which I'll just highlight here, is in keeping with our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Our second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships. And our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. You also noted the action, right? And so here, they are making this call by saying the following actions are immediately needed to improve the life situations and safety of transgender and gender nonconforming people, so that we condemn anti-transgender legislation. And a lot of the legislation that we are seeing in this time is specifically targeting transgendered and nonconforming people, removing access to healthcare and reproductive care and choice.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, and on that point, one of the big things that happened during this decade, I'm sure we all remember, is the repeal and overturning of Roe v. Wade. That happened in, I believe it was 2022. I remember that. I'm sure, again, a lot of us do. It was really shocking. Um,
Shocking.
Shocking. Yeah, in the Dobbs v. Jackson case. And in that year, the General Assembly, similar to the proposal you just had up for 2026, they put out an action of immediate witness, basically coming out against the Supreme Court decision. And I thought the title was really interesting. It was "We Do Not Consent," which I think bringing in the like another portion of reproductive justice to, make their point was really interesting in this.
Mm-hmm.
But they also lay out ways that organizations can get involved. So, connecting to communities and alliances to build multi-faith movements. They're asking people to meet with their legislators and to speak publicly as people of faith who, want to work for reproductive justice and to build networks of support for abortion seekers. I know that one thing I've become more aware of in the past few years is I believe it's called the Auntie Network,
Mm.
which is a network of women who will sort of underground support women to get abortions in states where it's not legal.
Yeah.
And so they'll do something like, oh, we'll take you camping, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you'll go home a few days later and no one will be any the wiser. And it actually reminds me of there was a podcast that I listened to for units 4 and 5 called Sexing History. And they talked about a very similar process that they would undergo in the 60s and 70s,
Mm-hmm.
where women would just drive other women to go get abortions, drive them home, take the risk. And I think this level of direct action and support speaks to our beliefs, right? It's one thing to say that we support these things, and it's another thing to say that people should do things. But it's
Mm-hmm.
a third thing to actually build the structures and have the funding and the support and the legal support, et cetera, for people who are going to do the work. And so that's something that I see as well kind of growing in this time period for the UUA.
Definitely. What I'm sharing is this from our 2017 General Assembly. The vote on Statement of Conscience actually included more on reproductive health, where
Mhm.
it aims that women are especially vulnerable to economic inequity. The gender gap, pay gap, has lifelong financial effects and contributes directly to increased poverty levels of women of all ages, races, and cultural backgrounds. And then lack of access to affordable and effective reproductive health care threatens the economic well being of women and their families. This one was a little both surprising and welcoming. Again, it's 2017, so women are being named specifically. And then we go right down into marginalized people, people of color, LGBTQA people, gender diverse people. And so we begin to lift all peoples there. Um,
Yeah.
but there's something about this that feels really good because everyone is being named,
Mhm.
and that's really important. That sometimes that is a struggle when we want to include and name everyone, and God forbid we leave an identity off.
Right.
But we also know how important it is to not have these groups and or people actually named. The other thing that I wanted to bring up in alignment with this is in this stretch of time, we've also seen a lot of work being done with and for in alignment with Planned Parenthood yet
Yes,
again.
absolutely.
What was your take on that, knowing that history and arc of where we have come?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, so one, it's really amazing that the sort of activities of Planned Parenthood were increasing at a time when there were also so many more threats to their activities, right? Like this is the time period where we were at the end of the Obama era and then the beginning of Trump's first presidency. And, one of the things Trump campaigned on, and then one of the first things he did was like restricting abortion rights. And his election allowed states to, feel free to start passing abortion bans. And so it's really amazing that there was still this push to engage in advocacy from Planned Parenthood. I think it's interesting that we're still seeing violence against abortion clinics. So that was a really big thing in the 70s and 80s. Now, I think back then it was maybe a little bit more taboo or less common, right, for abortion clinics to be operating. There was, especially in like the 80s, the beginning of protests against abortion clinics. But prior to that, I think it was so small scale that there wasn't just a ton of resistance against it. As
Mm-hmm.
soon as the operation started becoming more public and honestly probably more used, there began to be both this political opposition to and religious opposition to the activities, right? So we see this like evangelicalism starting to come up against Planned Parenthood. But for the first like 5 or 10 years, it was mostly just protests,
Mm-hmm.
like peaceful protests, coming out in opposition to the idea. But then around the 80s, I think the political support combined with the religious evangelicalism led people to feel, I guess, more like safe in being more violent in their opposition to this, right? And so it was in the late 80s that we started seeing like bombings of Planned Parenthood and
Mm-hmm.
attacks on doctors and
Mm-hmm.
clinicians and people who get abortions. I think as we've moved forward, the political opposition and religious opposition to abortion has maybe just continued to increase. I think what's changed a little bit is the nature of the violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, not to say that the state, the world that we live in, especially the country that we live in, doesn't allow violence to happen. They certainly do. But I think we're also in a situation where, especially after 9/11, it's a lot more legally dangerous to go out and like bomb a building,
Mm,
right? People are much less likely to commit outright acts of domestic terrorism like that. But
mm,
what we do see is an increase in political attacks on abortion access. That was something that really ramped up during the Bush administration. I think
mhm.
set the stage for people like Trump to then come in and continue that work. And we're seeing a lot more like moral and I want to say ethical in quotations because it doesn't feel ethical to me,
Right.
but ethical attacks on people, right? And I think this comes back to like the flip side of UU values and beliefs is other people using values and beliefs to really attack people who get abortions. So maybe it's not physical violence, although I'm sure that certainly does happen, but there is the violence of standing outside abortion clinics and shouting vitriol at people getting the abortions. It's doxing people who provide abortions
Mhm,
online. It's lawsuits against abortion providers. Now we know that in states where abortion is banned, doctors can lose their licenses and face jail time for performing these services. And so I think the violence is different. It's amazing that Planned Parenthood is continuing to operate, especially because, in addition to abortion, Planned Parenthood provides so many other types of reproductive services. And coming back to this intersectionality piece, you
mhm,
know, I think abortion is like a very small percent of the services they actually provide, and much more is like prenatal care and
mhm.
STI testing and birth control, all of these things that feed into reproductive justice. And so, yeah, I think it has been a really interesting trend to watch sort of over the arc of history. But I'm glad that they are still around to do the work that they are doing today. Yeah.
Most definitely. Well, Susie, thank you so much for your insight on this subject and matter. I feel like there's so much more that we can talk about and go into. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to a bit more.
Yay, great. Thank you, Dana.
Thank you so much, Susie. I will be in touch